Hello guys, today we are going to discuss exception handling in Java. The exception handling in Java is one of the powerful mechanisms to handle the runtime errors so that normal flow of the application can be maintained. Now what is exception? An exception is a problem that arises during the execution of a program. When an exception occurs, the normal flow of the program is disrupted and the program or application terminates abnormally, which is not recommended. So these exceptions are to be handled. Now, how exception occurs in Java? An exception can occur for many different reasons. Following are some scenarios where an exception occurs. First one, a user had entered an invalid data. Second, a file that needs to be opened can't be found. Third, a network connection has been lost in the middle of communications or the JVM has run out of memory. Now, types of exception. So we have three categories of exceptions. We need to understand them to know how exception handling works in Java. Checked exceptions. A checked exception is an exception that is checked by the compiler at compilation time. These are also compiled as compile time exceptions. These exceptions cannot simply be ignored. The programmer should take care of these exceptions. For example, if we use FileReader class in our program to read data from a file, if a file specified in its constructor doesn't exist, then a file not found exception occurs and the compiler prompts the programmer to handle the exception. Second one is unchecked exceptions. An unchecked exception is an exception that occurs at the time of execution. These are also called as runtime exceptions. These include programming bugs such as logic errors or improper use of an API. Runtime error exceptions are ignored at the time of compilation. For example, if we have declared an array of size 5 in our program and trying to call the sixth element of the array, then an array index out of bound exception occurs. Third one is error. So these are not exceptions but problems that arise beyond the control of the user or the programmer. Errors are typically ignored in our code because we can rarely do anything about an error. So for example, if a stack overflow occurs, an error will rise. They are also ignored at the time of compilation. So now how JVM handle an exception? Whenever inside a method, if an exception has occurred, the method creates an object known as exception object and hands it off to the JVM. The exception object contains name and description of the exception and current state of the program where exception has occurred. Creating the exception object and handling it to the runtime system is called throwing an exception. Here might be the list of the methods that had been called to get to the method where an exception was occurred. This ordered list of the methods is called call stack. Now the following procedure will begin. The runtime system searches the call stack to find the method that contains block of code that can handle the occurred exception. The block of the code is called exception handler. Now the runtime system starts searching from the method in which exception occurred, proceeds through call stack in the reverse order in which methods were called. If it finds appropriate handler, then it passes the occurred exception to it. Appropriate handler means the type of the exception object thrown matches the type of the exception object it can handle. Now, if runtime system searches all the methods on call stack and couldn't have found the appropriate handler, then runtime system hand over the exception object to default exception handler, which is part of runtime system. So this handler prints the exception information in the following format and terminates program abnormally. So let's see this code to demonstrate how exception is thrown. So here is one string str which is set as null. So now we have to print length of the string. So see, there is exception runtime error. So it in an exception in thread main java.lang.null pointer exception at throws except.main. Now let's move to the document. Let us see an example to illustrate that how runtime system searches appropriate exception handling code on the call stack. So here is the code for the same. So there is one class exception thrown. It throws the exception actually divide by 0 is the exception. So here we have to divide 1 by 0. So as we know that we can't divide any number by 0, so it should throw one exception. And here we are using try block and here catch to catch that exception. So it will print the description of exception, that is divide by 0, get message. So let's run this code and see what it says. So it says output divide by 0 because here we know that the exception is divide by 0 type. So here by using get message we have printed the description of exception, that it is divide by 0 type of exception. So let's move to the code. Now how programmer handles an exception. Java exception handling is managed via 5 keywords: try, catch, throw, throws, finally. Briefly, here is how they work. Program statements that you think can raise exceptions are contained within a try block. If an exception occurs within the try block, it is thrown. Your code can catch this exception and handle it in some rational manner. System generated exceptions are automatically thrown by the Java runtime system. To manually throw an exception, use the keyword throw. An exception that is thrown out of a method must be specified as such by a throws clause. Any code that absolutely must be executed after a try block completes is put in a finally block. So here it is a syntax like a try block is here. Here is a catch. These are actually exception handlers for different exceptions, and it is finally, it is optional, like after the try block ends what to be done. So this piece of code is executed after try block. Now points to remember: in a method there can be more than one statements that might throw exception. So put all these statements within its own try block and provide separate exception handler with an own catch block for each of them. Second, if an exception occurs within the try block, that exception is handled by the exception handler associated with it. To associate exception handler, we must put catch block after it. There can be more than one exception handlers. Each catch block is an exception handler that handles the exception of the type indicated by its argument. The argument exception type declares the type of the exception that it can handle and must be the name of the class that inherits from throwable class. For each try block, there can be 0 or more catch blocks, but only one finally block, which is actually optional. So the finally block is optional. It always gets executed whether an exception occurred in try block or not. If exception occurs, then it will be executed after try and catch block. If doesn't occur, then it will be executed after try block. The finally block in Java is used to put important code such as cleanup code, example closing the file or closing the connection. So that's all about exception handling in Java. So thank you guys for watching this video.